Okay, so you want to answer questions about speed. The way that you have to do it is to be able to answer three separate types of questions. The first is how long. So how long really talks about how long something takes to happen. In physics, we talk about events or phenomena. So in this case, we're going to say an event. So an event might be your trip to your grandma's house. So how long does the trip to your grandma's house take? That's what we're talking about. You can already see we're talking about time. And so the first variable we're going to learn about in physics is time. It's cool because you've already learned a bunch about time. You use time every day, probably every second of every day. So your understanding of time is probably pretty good, which is great. It's a great place to start. Time is always symbolized with the variable little t. So little t is right there. Now, I will say, I know I just said always, but I lied just a little bit because I wanted to keep things simple. I will be honest with you. Sometimes I use a slightly different version of it, and that is delta t. Why the heck would I use delta t? You may remember from chemistry class that delta means change. So delta t means the change in the time. So let's say you start your stopwatch and an event happens or starts at 10 seconds on your stopwatch and it ends at 20 seconds on your stopwatch. Did the event take 20 seconds to happen? No, it started at 10 and it ended at 20. So the change in the time is really just 10 seconds, right? 20 minus 10. And so that's why sometimes I'll use delta t. Just keep that in the back of your mind for right now. Not a big deal. Time is measured in the metric system in seconds. And so we always want to use seconds. There is one exception, and we abbreviate it with a little s. There's one exception, and that one exception is in astronomy. In astronomy, things take a long time to happen, and so oftentimes the main unit for time is years, not seconds, because they take a long time. Okay, so second question, here it is, how far? Easy, right? In reality, there's actually some complications that occur when you talk to people, even everyday average adults, when they ask you a question like, how far? I'll give you an example. If I ask you, how far is your pencil from where you're seated, you could tell me it's, I don't know, 40 inches or 35 centimeters or 2 feet, something along those lines. All these different units that you could use for something that's a very short distance away from you. In the lab here, we usually deal with only short distances when we're talking about how far. In real life, though, oftentimes somebody's asking you something like, how far is it to the restaurant? Or how far away does your grandma live? Those kinds of questions, people give a number of different answers. But typically, people say something like this. Hey, how far does your grandma live from here? Oh, she's about 6 hours. 6 hours is not an answer to a question of how far. It's actually a question of how long. So I want to put that in your mind for right now, because think about that. We're going to address that in just a minute. How far, though, is really asking about distance. And so you want to make sure that every time you answer the question, how far, in this class, you answer it about distance. Okay, that's what we want to talk about, distance. We measure the distance usually in a straight line between two objects. When we talk about distance, we oftentimes use the variable d. D is the common variable. I wrote a little low there. So D is the common one that we're going to use. It's very closely related to other variables, S and X, and we're going to talk about those later on. They're different. S is typically in calculus. X is typically as a different kind, not really distance, but related in physics, so we have to be careful. Distance in physics is measured in the metric system in meters. And that's abbreviated with a lowercase m. I know you want to use inches or feet or centimeters even, because those are what you've used in other classes. But in this class, because we use units that are based off of the three main types of units, the distance unit, the time unit, and the mass unit, we have to use those specific units that make up all the other different units in physics. And so for distance, it's got to be in meters. So please make sure you remember that. All right, so we're finally here. The third question. Remember, the topic is speed. So far, we've been talking about how long and how far. So how long? Time. How far? Distance. So finally, we can answer the question, how fast? And how fast, if you think about it, the answer has got to be a speed. And if you've answered the first two, There we go. First two questions. You really, in your head, probably are already starting to figure out what the speed is. For example, it takes me 2 hours to get to my grandma's house. She lives 100 miles away. So automatically in your head, you're probably already thinking, well, if it's 100 miles away and it's 2 hours, then I can figure out how many miles per hour it takes, or I have to go to get there, for those two things to be true. So 100 miles in 2 hours is a speed. So you can see the speed's going to be a ratio. And the speed here, I'm going to symbolize with a V. Now, keep in mind, when I write my V's, they look cursive. Okay, that's okay. That's all right. Don't worry about it. There's a reason for that, and we can talk about that reason for it later on. So V is the speed. And it's measured using the formula, or calculated using the formula, D divided by T. So V equals D divided by T. There's our formula right there for the speed. You've probably already learned it in middle school. You probably practiced it. It's a good refresher here. V equals D divided by T. 100 miles in 2 hours. So you divide 100 miles divided by 2 hours gives me 50 miles in 1 hour, or 50 miles per hour. That's what my speed would be in that case. Now, I know I just used miles per hour. That's the last time in this class you're ever going to hear me say miles per hour. It's just the way that it is. So just keep that in mind. Because the units for speed are in meters per second. Or if you want to abbreviate, which I always do, meters per second, like that. So just keep that in mind. So here's another way to think about speed. Here's the formula. Speed equals distance divided by time. You can think about speed as a way to convert distance into time, or time into distance. In chemistry class, you probably had a bunch of things called conversion factors. So you probably had one type of unit, and you wanted to make it into a different type of unit. So in between, you multiplied it one side by a conversion factor. It was called dimensional analysis, probably. We do dimensional analysis in physics too, but it's not so often because we're typically trying to stick with meters and kilograms and seconds always. Then we don't have to convert too much between units. But it does happen sometimes. So speed can be thought of as totally a conversion factor. You've got a distance and you want to make it a time? Awesome. Use the speed. You got a time and you want to make it the distance? Awesome. Use the speed. It's just a conversion factor. To see this, you want to be able to rearrange this algebraically. So I know this is a nice way to calculate it, but there's actually a better way to use it. And to do that, I need to get time over here. So I'm going to multiply both sides by t using my algebra magic. And I end up with this. D equals V times T. Awesome. Doesn't look like it's an easier formula, but it is. Because look, you've got distance on this side, you've got time on that side. The thing that converts the time into the distance is the speed. It's a conversion factor. All right, so we learned a little bit about speed, maybe reviewed a little bit about speed. If you have questions on it, you can rewatch this video. That's my first suggestion there. You can go to the website for the class. You can go check out any classroom where I probably have put extra resources as well. You can text me using my Google Voice number. You can email me using my email address from school. You can usermind.com to get in touch with me. All sorts of different options. You can come in early in the morning before school and I'll try to answer questions for you. But really the most important one, and this is the reason why we're watching these things at home, is because you do that on your own, right? You watch these things on your own. You don't really need to be interacting with me to be able to do that. But when you're starting to think your way through the concepts, that's when we want to do that in class together, you and me together, so that we can talk it through. And so that's what I hope you use the class time for. If you have any questions, bring them with you. Ask me now if they're crucial, but bring them with you to class and we'll talk it through, because my guess is everybody's got the same kind of questions. Thanks for watching.